All right, we're going to get started again to try to stay on time for this this program. I'm giving the next talk. I'm Greg Waselkov. I'm going to talk about the ancient canoe canal that we've been working on in the last few years in Gulf Shores, right here in town. And this is a project that began actually quite a few years ago. Harry King, who is a local fan of the canal, he came by the museum on campus at the University of South Alabama many times to convince me to come take a look at it. And I'd heard about the canal years ago, but had been a little dubious of it, I guess, because it is a huge feature that seemed kind of out of place given what we know about other such features in the Gulf Coast, northern Gulf Coast area. I wasn't really very familiar with the ones in Florida, which I'll mention in a few minutes, but anyway, we came to take a look at it. It was an extremely impressive feature and deserves some attention. So I have worked for many years with a group of really great dedicated volunteers from the Mobile area. And so we gathered the troops. Bonnie Gums kind of leads this volunteer effort. And we had maybe a dozen or so of us that came out and with Harry and other folks who gradually joined us from the Gulf Shores community, we began to figure out ways that we could study this canal. And one of the first things we did was take a little sample from the berm, the dirt that had been piled up on the side of this large ditch-like feature. And when the radiocarbon date came back around 580 to 650 AD, I was convinced that we were not dealing with an antebellum feature or anything modern at all, but actually something very ancient and very rare. These are extremely rare features, these canoe canals. So that's at that point I became much more serious about it, and we have ever since then. It's about 3 years now of intermittent work on this big feature. So what we do know, of course, is that there have been hundreds of dugout canoes found throughout the southeast. These are very commonly found actually in lakes and after storms along the coast and on river banks. They'll turn up all the time after storms in particular. And so we know the kind of canoes that were used. These are very sturdy boats that were used for long distance as well as local travel. I think it'd be a mistake to think that our kind of focus on highway travel, on land travel, is a very old kind of thing. I think actually water travel was far more important to most people until fairly recent times throughout the southeast. So this is really a kind of an understudied topic that we've been trying to tackle as well. The canal itself has been reported on and off for the last couple centuries, as I'll show you. But it basically runs where that green line is located from Oyster Bay here. That green line goes down to Little Lagoon, this back bay area. And it's about a half mile long. Only 2 sections are visible today. Here's Harry in his effort to try to photograph this thing. It's actually a very difficult kind of feature to photograph because it is generally just covered with palmettos and all kinds of other vegetation. But by laying these ladders across, you can see it's about 20 feet in interior dimensions, about 30 feet from the edge of the berms. Pretty big feature, and it ran a half mile. So it's really very extensive digging that went on to build this feature. Unfortunately, only 2 sections are left today to study easily from the ground surface indications. Harry sent along this photo from Joy Calloway. She and her family put up a sign, which she just told me was immediately stolen, so it didn't last too long, but it did indicate the location of this, what locals had long called the Indian Ditch, where it crosses Fort Morgan Road. And this is the same area that we're working on primarily these days. Curry Weber is one of the local volunteers here who has been really diligent in searching the internet for all kinds of leads and has come up with some pretty remarkable discoveries. This is the first issue of the Spring Hill Review from Spring Hill College back in 1899 included an article by one of the sophomores in that class. He had taken some photographs of the mouth of the canal, which is that lower bluish picture, and it essentially looks the same today. It really hasn't changed. That area is very much as it was. And then an interior shot, which is the typical problem we always have had. I'm sorry, keep hitting the wrong buttons here, but this view of the palmettos is about all you can see of the interior of the canal. back in that time. But it does establish there's been a continuous knowledge of this feature, really actually since colonial times. Another of Curry's discoveries was back in the 1820s. There was a report issued by a member of the Quartermaster Department of the U.S. Army who had been sent into the vicinity to study possible road and canal locations, and that eventually ended up in this really large-scale study of the entire U.S. Gulf Coast in the 1830s by a French engineer. And they were proposing building canals. This is the Erie Canal building era, when people were building canals all over the world at this point. And so this fellow Poussin proposed that they build one right where the Intracoastal Waterway exists today. This earlier report by Captain Birch, which was finally printed in the 1830s, but actually dates sometime in the 1820, 26, 27 period. When he was down here, he was walking around talking to locals, and he says he ran into the vestiges of a canal shown to me by one of the oldest residents of the county. That was actually very convincing evidence this is ancient and not a historic feature in and of itself, but even without the archaeology, because the local folks knew at that time that it was very, very old. Birch did leave a sketch map, which a researcher that I hired in the National Archives located for us, and it says essentially the same thing that he had in his report, and it shows the dotted lines running from Oyster Bay, which was not called that at the time, down to Little Lagoon. In old aerials, we were able to trace with using some imagination. I'm not sure these are absolutely accurate, but you just seem to see little faint lines still evident, not only on the dry land portion, but out through the marshes of Oyster Bay, which is an interesting phenomenon that suggests these are in fact extremely old. There's been a lot of local subsidence in this region of the coast. It's perpetual, apparently, because of the effects of the sediment coming into the lower Mississippi Delta. It actually depresses the entire northern Gulf coastline about 1 millimeter a year, according to the hydrologist I talked to. So presumably that marsh area was not marshy at the time. I don't know how they could conceivably have dug a canal through a marsh, but it is marshy today, and so there's probably something under the marsh grasses out there. But we're focusing on the dry land portion as it exists now. I'm sure you've seen all kinds of uses of LiDAR imagery. It's extremely popular in archaeology throughout the world today. People are using it to find new pyramids in Egypt and cite Mayan fields and pyramids in the areas of Guatemala, that kind of thing. It does allow people to use aerial flights to penetrate through heavy vegetation, which is our problem surveying in this region as well. Unfortunately, there are only the two sections visible, but this shows it pretty well with the Little Lagoon portion still evident today, and then the interior portion. They're each about 100 or so yards long. There also are some associated small sites, which we've been trying to study as well. One is this one BA61 mound, kind of a bump on the LiDAR. There's a couple other bumps over here, which are part of the same site, and there are several others kind of scattered around, a cluster of sites of the same age as the canal near the southern end. This is the southern end as it exists today, and if we don't get a downpour, we'll go see it after lunch. I mean, pretty good shape. This is actually, just fortuitously, happens to be owned by the city of Gulf Shores. They purchased this property to build the big sewer trunk line that runs out underneath Little Lagoon over to the condos on the beach, and missed the canal by inches, but in the process of buying that property, they also inadvertently bought this end of the canal, which is a great accident. And so they seem to be, the officials that we've talked to are all quite enthusiastic about the fact that they own part of this canal, and there is talk of trying to develop that into a little pocket park so that people can come and see it and see some interpretive signage and learn more about it. And I think it would be an attraction for the community. Gives something people to do besides go to the beach. There are lots of people who come down here who may be dragged along by relatives who don't necessarily like the beach, and so kind of thinking in terms of other things that could be of interest to visitors. As far as field work, it's been entirely a volunteer project. Gulf Shores has supported us financially when needed, such as for the radiocarbon dates and for the geoprobe coring. And we did manage to hire Howard Sears, an excellent geoarchaeologist at the University of Tennessee, who took a look at the cores and other kinds of evidence of in the soils of how this canal was built and how it fell into disuse and the state it's in today. We've also dug a couple of cross sections in 2 different locations now of the canal with the help of some locals. This is Aubrey Fulford, one of the owners of one of the interior portion of the canal. Anyway, here's all of us digging away. We're trying to do as little digging as possible, trying to use kind of non-invasive methods whenever we can, try to preserve what is left of this feature. This is the first cross section we dug, and I'll try to explain the profile here in a second, but basically lots of hurricane deposits sitting on top of it. All this white sand right over here was dumped in during some really massive storm surge. I've talked to, Harry in particular has talked to lots of people who've been here all their lives, and they don't remember any time when the interior where this is located flooded. So this is a really exceptional storm event that created that deposit of sand there that would certainly put an end to the use of the canal at that point. That would have been the last uses. Here's one of our profiles. And just roughly, basically we have a berm. This is dirt that was dug out of the canal, piled up over here on the side. And then as you taper down into the bottom of the canal, you see this dark zone. And that's a layer of peat. It's all kinds of marsh grasses, roots that have accumulated. They're not carbonized, they're not burned. They're just old plant matter that's accumulated probably after abandonment of the canal, after it stopped being maintained by the people that built it. So we think that's conceivably a way to date the last use of the canal, which has been actually very challenging to establish how long it was in use. But we know when it was built because the carbon dating that came from underneath the berm probably relates to the fact that they would have had to burn the forest repeatedly to be able to get rid of all the trees and the roots, which are, when we dig in this kind of region, digging in sand is nothing. It's dealing with the roots is the challenge. And so we're taking repeated burnings to be able to eventually dig a canal through this area. So we think that's what accumulated and allowed us to date the beginning of the canal's use. And then just recently we dug a second partial transect. This was actually right next to that sewer trunk line, so it was truncated by the sewer line, but we did have a little remnant, the same kind of profile of berm over here, and then a layer of organic matter in the bottom of the canal there. And then with Erin Nelson, my colleague at the University of South Alabama, she has connections with the people at Ole Miss who do geophysics, remote sensing of various sorts, and so we had Stephen Harris come over from there to do ground penetrating radar, hoping that we could detect other pieces of the canal without having to trench every few hundred yards. So far it hasn't really worked out. We have all kinds of trouble with remote sensing in this region, and so far we're still kind of puzzled by why a big feature like this doesn't show up very, but essentially we know it ran right through here, and we're not quite sure what happens up in this region. We don't really seem to be able to follow it at all there. So we know the date. That puts us into the end of the middle woodland. The pottery all fits into what's called the Porter phase in this region. And the dates, as I said, they're very much in line with each other. We do have some really bizarre dates. We have I think a date around 6,000 years old from material in the canal, which washed in apparently during a hurricane. Has nothing to do with the canal. So there are all kinds of other things that we have to kind of filter out to try to decide what really applies to the canal feature itself. As I mentioned, there's little sites right adjacent to the canal are really quite interesting, very nice little sites that haven't been disturbed by modern development. They were missed by a few feet by the construction of Fort Morgan Road. And so again, with volunteer help, we've excavated a couple of these. Basically, they're little accumulations of shells and fish bones from people who were processing food taken apparently from Little Lagoon. They'd cook and dry the shellfish and fish, and then transport the food elsewhere. So there's all kinds of evidence of cooking and roasting of the shellfish and other those kinds of activities there. And they did this repeatedly in the same or relatively same spots. So you get these overlapping piles of debris from different kinds of cooking episodes, which you can see in profile here. These little piles of shell accumulated over briefly, probably within a couple of days. Each little segment of the shell midden probably dates to just a few days of effort, but over time you get these accumulations. So it actually is quite an evident mound. And as we were digging in this midden, we saw all kinds of different sorts of shellfish, or little clusters of clams in some areas, scallops in others, coquinas in others, probably individual little food processing events in this overall midden. So the various kinds of shells that we have found there. One in particular that I'm always intrigued by is the number of angel wings that have turned up here. I don't know anybody that's ever eaten an angel wing, but I did find one wild food guide, and the fellow said he thought they tasted excellent. So apparently the Mid-11 people agreed with him because they're really quite abundant here. Super fragile shells, but a little fairly substantial bit of food inside. And then all kinds of bone tools show up here, which are really quite scarce on other sorts of sites. And because the shell in these middens tends to neutralize soil acidity, the acid soils around here are really hard on bones, whether it's animal or human remains. They're just really not present on most sites, but on shell middens you do find these rare kinds of artifacts. And then, of course, the pottery. There's another site we've excavated not too far away that is a little bit earlier. We don't think it's associated with the canal, but there are, the area really is very rich archaeologically, and we're learning a tremendous amount from just very small excavations because there has been so little work done on the Fort Morgan Peninsula. So how did this canal work? This is the question we're trying to work out with hydrologists, try to understand how this thing functioned. Actually calling it an Indian ditch sort of suggests that it ran at water level from one body of water to another. So you go down below water table and you connect them, and that was my first impression. But we quickly learned that the interior portion of the canal is well above sea level, like 6 feet above sea level. So it didn't work by water flowing from one body of water to the other. It depended on high water table at certain times of the year. So we think they were seasonally able to use the canal. Would have taken some maintenance to keep cleaning out the canal because these built-in sand, they would tend to fill in through time. So a lot of effort really involved in doing this, and a lot of sophisticated engineering. They understood how the hydrology works in this region, certainly better than I did when I first began to think about this. So take really quite a remarkable achievement to build a canal like this. As I mentioned, there are others known. The one in northwest Florida no longer exists. It was recorded back in the 1890s, I believe, and vanished soon afterwards under development. But the ones in South Florida, some of those are still quite intact, and the ones in the Everglades in particular are quite impressive still. Some of these are several miles long, or even larger than ours, but all very much the same sort of thing. They go above sea level. Actually, one of them goes through a sand dune in the city of Naples. All using the same basic engineering principles, apparently. The other question we've always had is not only who was using it, but why were they going to all this trouble to build this canal? We know that the resources, the fish and shellfish from Oyster Bay, which was the local population center, there's a large site on what's today Plash Island, right up in here, and that's probably the population that built the canal. So one possibility is they simply built this to ease exploitation of the resources in Little Lagoon to feed the population up in further north. But that does seem like an awful lot of effort to go to, even in spite of even considering the fact that canoeing around Fort Morgan Point and out into the Gulf would have been a death-defying exercise. And so, there's certainly practical reasons why you would want to avoid having to go out into the Gulf to reach the lagoons that kind of line the Gulf Coast there. But also we know that there's long distance travel, not only north-south, but east-west through this region from at least as early as the Middle period. And so we do find trade goods from further north, things like copper in this region. We find shell from the Gulf Coast up in northern sites. So we know there's long distance travel, and that's another good reason, I think, Well, there are probably other reasons as well. We know that American Indians did very little without considering the religious significance of what they were doing, and so there are other kinds of possibilities we're kind of trying to understand as well as to why they would have gone to this trouble. These are the people, the Middle Woodland people are the ones that built the very impressive earthworks really throughout the eastern part of North America. Some are extremely impressive ones in Louisiana, Marksville area of Louisiana and adjacent Mississippi, all the way up into the Ohio Valley where they're very famous earthworks. So we have knowledge of the ability of people to move dirt in impressive and very precise ways. And so this is just kind of expanding on that other kind of information we do have. As I said, this is one section of the canal is preserved. We hope that it can be developed for public interpretation fairly soon. And I just wanted to thank about 1 million people here who have been involved in the project. So thank you. Be glad to try to answer any questions. Anybody have any comments? Yeah, Matt?
W.B. Jones talked about a canal system that actually went all the way over to Wolf Bay and possibly beyond that, using a combination of the natural waterways. Do you have any opportunities to look at other areas that may tie into this?
Well, that certainly was what occurred to us at first when we realized that this is in fact an ancient feature, is the fact that I kind of blew it off for years, and probably other people have not been aware of the possibilities that there are others like this. There has been speculation for years that there was a big canal associated with the Bottle Creek, Mississippian site up in the Mobile-Tensaw Delta. I've been dubious of that as well, but mainly because the fact that nobody has actually done some digging to try to confirm. I think it's a really likely candidate. The others I don't know. We've been trying to locate kind of over the years, last couple of years here, more information from W.B. Jones' survey, because he's the one that first identified the small midden sites we're working on. He does talk about the canal. He published on it in several in American Antiquity and several other locations in 1933. So he was quite impressed by it and aware of its importance, but we haven't been able to find any of his photographs or some of the notes have surfaced recently, but we're still searching for that. It would be really nice to know what he knew about this. We'd like to pursue those ideas. All right, thank you.